What if I told you? There was a moment when cars stopped being simple machines and started becoming something much more. Picture this. Early 1950s, the world coming out of the post-war era. Everything beginning to change, and little by little, cars changing with it. Until then, many were still practical, functional, almost with no intention of standing out. But something started to happen. Lines became smoother. Proportions began to evolve. Details started to matter. For the first time, cars weren't just built to be used. They were built to be seen. So in this video, you're going to discover the most beautiful cars of the early 1950s. And some of them weren't just beautiful. They were the beginning of something much bigger. 1950, Cadillac Series, 62. This car didn't look revolutionary, but it was. Because when you see it today, it might seem simply elegant, clean, even normal for its time. But in 1950, this was something else entirely. Imagine the context, late 1940s. Cars still heavily influenced by pre-war design, more rigid shapes, more functional, less focused on standing out. And suddenly, this appears, lower, longer, more fluid. The lines begin to connect in a real way. The car stops looking like separate pieces and starts feeling like a unified whole. And that's where everything changes. Because the Cadillac Series 62 isn't just beautiful. It's one of the first cars that starts to feel modern. The fenders no longer stick out as much. The body becomes more integrated. The front gains presence, and for the first time, design feels intentional. It's not just shape, it's identity. And in 1950, that wasn't common. There's a detail that makes it even more interesting. Cadillac at that moment wasn't just leading in luxury, it was starting to define the future of design. What they did here, many other brands would follow. And this model is one of those references. It's not extreme, it's not radical, but it's the starting point. And that gives it a completely different kind of value, because a car doesn't need to be extreme to be important. Sometimes, it just needs to be first. Inside, everything followed that same idea: comfort, space, but now with a more refined feeling, more thoughtful, more aligned with what the exterior already suggested. Everything started to come together. When you look at its value today, that importance is still reflected. A 1950 Cadillac Series 62 typically ranges between $30,000 and $70,000, depending on condition and originality. 1951, Hudson Hornet. This car didn't seem especially beautiful, at least not in the traditional way. But when you look at it more carefully, you start to understand it, because the Hudson Hornet doesn't follow the same rules as other cars of its time. While many were still figuring out their identity, Hudson did something completely different. It lowered everything, literally. Its famous step-down construction placed the body inside the frame, not on top of it, and that changed everything. The car looked lower, wider, more connected to the road, and in the early 1950s, that was rare, very rare, because most cars were still taller, more upright, less visually integrated. The Hornet broke away from that, and that's where its kind of beauty appears. It's not a beauty based on luxury or chrome details. It's a beauty of proportion, of stance, of how the car occupies space. When you see it in profile, everything works. The line flows, the silhouette has intention, and for the first time in a long time, an American car feels truly planted, and that gives it a unique personality. There's a key detail here. This design wasn't just visually different, it changed how the car behaved. The lower center of gravity made it more stable, more controlled, more dynamic, and that led to something unexpected. It dominated NASCAR in the early 1950s, and that completely changes how you see it, because this car didn't just look different, it performed differently. And that's the perfect contrast. A car that doesn't seem impressive at first glance, but once you understand it, it becomes impossible to ignore, because its beauty isn't obvious, it's intelligent. When you look at its value today, that uniqueness is reflected as well. A 1951 Hudson Hornet typically ranges between $40,000 and $100,000, with well-restored examples going even higher. It's not the brightest, it's not the most eye-catching, but it's probably one of the most interesting, because this car doesn't try to win you over instantly. It makes you look twice, and that's where it wins. 1953. Buick Skylark. This car didn't need an explanation, because from the very first glance, it already felt special. It wasn't just beautiful, it was different, because the Skylark wasn't created as just another model in Buick's lineup. It was built to celebrate the brand's 50th anniversary, and that allowed something unusual: freedom. Freedom to build a car with fewer limitations. And you can see it. The body sits lower, much lower than other Buicks of the time. The cut-down doors, the more exposed wheels. Everything feels like it's trying to break away from what already existed. It doesn't follow the formula, it rewrites it. And that gives it a completely unique presence. Because while other early 1950s cars were still searching for their identity, this one already looked like a step ahead. More refined, more modern, more confident. And there's a detail that makes it even more interesting. The Skylark was, in essence, a heavily modified version of existing Buick models, but pushed to another level. It wasn't entirely new, but it felt like it was. And that says something important. You don't always need to start from scratch to create something special. Sometimes, you just need to do it better. Inside, the same philosophy continues. Better materials, unique details, a feeling that every element was designed to stand out. Everything aligned, everything intentional, and you can feel it. When you look at its value today, that exclusivity is reflected clearly. A 1953 Buick Skylark can easily exceed $100,000, with exceptional examples going much higher. And now, I want to know something. Out of the cars we've seen so far, do you prefer the classic elegance of the Cadillac, or this more daring design approach like the Skylark? I'll read you in the comments. 1953. Chevrolet Corvette. This car didn't seem like it belonged to this era, and maybe it didn't entirely. Because while most early 1950s cars were still evolving from existing ideas, the Corvette arrived as something completely different. Lower, lighter, more focused, almost like it came from somewhere else. And you could feel that instantly. It didn't have the size of a Cadillac. It didn't have the luxury of a Buick. It didn't have the dominant presence of other American cars. But it had something none of them had: real, sporting intention. And that changed everything. The proportions make it obvious. Long hood, setback cabin, cleaner lines, no excessive chrome, no unnecessary elements. Everything had a purpose. And at that moment, that was new, very new. Because this car wasn't trying to be the most elegant, or the most comfortable, or the most imposing. It was trying to be something else entirely. And it succeeded. There's a key detail here. The 1953 Corvette was America's first real attempt at building a modern sports car. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was the direction. And you can see that in how it's perceived today. Its beauty doesn't come from excess. It comes from simplicity, from how every line feels like it belongs exactly where it is, effortless, unforced. And that gives it a completely different identity in this list. Because this isn't about luxury, it's about intention. When you look at its value today, that becomes very clear. A 1953 Chevrolet Corvette can easily exceed $150,000, with well-preserved examples reaching even higher. 1952, Lincoln Capri. This car wasn't trying to be modern, and that's exactly why it works so well, because while some early 1950s cars were experimenting, changing proportions, searching for something new, Lincoln chose a different path, to perfect what already worked, and the Capri is exactly that. A car that doesn't break from the past, it elevates it. The lines are more classic, more formal, with a presence that feels solid, almost architectural. There's no intention to look light or dynamic. There's an intention to look important, and it succeeds. Because this car doesn't stand out because of one detail, it stands out because of the whole. Everything is balanced, everything is in place, and that creates a different kind of beauty, more serious, more restrained, but just as strong. There's a key detail behind this. Lincoln, at that time, was directly competing with Cadillac. It couldn't afford to go too radical. It had to offer something that felt just as prestigious, but with its own identity. And that's exactly what you see here. This car doesn't try to innovate too much. It tries to communicate solidity, confidence, status, and it does that through design, the taller proportions, the dominant front end, the way it carries itself on the road. Everything points to that. And when you see it in context, it makes perfect sense. Because not every car of that era needed to define the future. Some simply represented the best of the present, and this is one of them. When you look at its value today, that balance is still there. A 1952 Lincoln Capri typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, depending on condition and originality. It's not the most innovative, it's not the most eye-catching, but it might be one of the most solid, because this car doesn't try to surprise you. It tries to convince you, and it does it, without ever needing to exaggerate. 1950, Oldsmobile 88. This car didn't seem special, but it changed more than most people realize, because at first glance, the Oldsmobile 88 fits perfectly into the look of its time. Rounded lines, classic proportions, a design that doesn't try too hard to stand out. But that's exactly where people get it wrong, because this car didn't need attention. It was already doing something far more important, being one of the first to combine two worlds, a relatively lightweight body with a serious V8. And in the early 1950s, that wasn't common. In fact, it was revolutionary, because up until that point, fast cars usually came with compromises, more weight, more size, more limitations. But the 88 changed that formula, and you could feel it immediately, not just on the street, but on the track, because this car dominated NASCAR in its early years. And that completely changes its story. It's no longer just a beautiful car, it's a car that opened the door. And when you look at it from that perspective, everything shifts. The lines stop being simple and start looking like the beginning of something. A new way of understanding American cars, more dynamic, more alive, more connected to the driving experience. And that's where its beauty lies, not in what it shows, but in what it represents. There's an important detail. Many consider the Oldsmobile 88 to be one of the first proto-muscle cars, a concept that would fully explode years later. And this was one of the starting points. When you look at its value today, that history still carries weight. A 1950 Oldsmobile 88 typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, with well-preserved examples reaching higher. And now I want to know something. Would you choose a car like this? Something more historical that changed everything? Or do you prefer cars that stand out purely for their design, like the Skylark or the Corvette? I'll read you in the comments. 1951, Mercury 8. This car wasn't designed to stand out, but it became an icon anyway. And not because of what it was from the factory, but because of what people turned it into. Because when the Mercury 8 came out, it was a solid car, well-proportioned, with smoother lines than many of its competitors. It wasn't radical, it wasn't extreme, but it had something very important, a foundation, a perfect base to be transformed, and that's exactly what happened. In the early 1950s, custom car culture started to grow, people modifying their cars, lowering them, smoothing out the lines, removing details, trying to create something more personal. And the Mercury 8 was the perfect canvas. Its silhouette allowed all of it. Lower roof lines, cleaner bodywork, even more fluid proportions. And suddenly, the car changed completely. It became more elegant, more refined, almost like a version ahead of its time. And that's where its real beauty appears. It's not just the original design, it's what that design made possible, what it inspired. And that makes it something very different in this list. Because this car doesn't just represent what it was, it represents what it could become. There's a key detail here. Many of the Mercury 8s you see today, especially in iconic photos, are modified. And that helped build its legend. It showed up in movies, in magazines, throughout American custom culture, and that defined its place in history. Because very few cars influenced how people understood design as much as this one did. When you look at its value today, that legacy is still reflected. A 1951 Mercury 8 typically ranges between $30,000 and $80,000, depending on condition, and especially its history or modifications. 1953. Packard Caribbean. This car wasn't trying to follow trends, it was trying to sit above them. Because Packard at that time wasn't playing the same game as everyone else. While others were experimenting with new ideas, Packard stayed focused on something very clear: exclusivity. And the Caribbean is exactly that. From the first glance, it feels different. Not just because of the design, but because of how it's executed. More refined, more precise, with an almost handcrafted feeling in every detail. The lines are smooth, elegant, without needing exaggeration. No excess, no elements fighting for attention. Everything flows, and that gives it a completely different presence, because this car isn't trying to impress everyone, only those who understand what they're looking at. There's a key detail here. The Caribbean wasn't a mass-produced model, it was almost a special edition, with a higher level of finish, built for a much smaller audience. And you can feel that. Every proportion, every chrome detail, every surface feels more intentional, more precise, and that separates it from the rest. Because here, beauty doesn't come from impact. It comes from refinement, from how everything fits together effortlessly. And at a time when many brands were experimenting, this was a bold statement. Packard didn't need to change much, because it already knew what it was doing. When you look at its value today, that exclusivity is clearly reflected. A 1953 Packard Caribbean can easily exceed $100,000, with exceptional examples reaching even higher. It's not the most famous, it's not the most radical, but it might be one of the most elegant, because this car doesn't try to impress you instantly. But once you understand it, it stays with you. 1952 Kaiser Manhattan. This car doesn't usually show up on lists like this, and that's exactly what makes it interesting. Because while the big brands dominated the conversation, there were others trying to do things differently. Kaiser was one of them, and the Manhattan makes that clear from the very first moment. It doesn't follow the same design language, it doesn't carry that traditional presence. And because of that, it feels different. The lines are cleaner, more modern, almost as if they were ahead of their time. There's less reliance on excess, fewer unnecessary chrome details, and a silhouette that feels more intentional, more controlled. It doesn't try to impress through size, it tries to do it through form, and that separates it from everything else. Because in a time when many cars were still defining what American design would become, the Manhattan feels like it's taking a parallel path, a more subtle one, but also a more daring one. There's a key detail here. Kaiser didn't have the weight of the major brands, and that gave it freedom. It could experiment, it could try different ideas, without being tied to what the market expected. And that shows in this car. It's not the most obvious, but it's one of the most interesting to analyze, because its beauty isn't immediate. It's not the kind of car that hits you in the first second, it's the kind that gets better the longer you look at it. And in design, that's very hard to achieve. When you look at its value today, that uniqueness still has its place. A 1952 Kaiser Manhattan typically ranges between $20,000 and $50,000, depending on condition and originality. 1954 Cadillac El Dorado. This car didn't feel like just another step. It felt like a statement. Because if the 1950 Cadillac marked the beginning, this showed just how far that idea could go. Lower, longer, more daring. Everything about the El Dorado feels more confident, like Cadillac was no longer experimenting, but declaring something. This is American luxury, and this is what it should look like. The lines don't just flow anymore, now they stand out. The chrome details are more intentional, more visible, but without breaking the harmony. The car doesn't lose elegance, it gains character, and that's what makes it special. Because here, there's no hesitation. This car knows exactly what it is. There's a key detail. The El Dorado wasn't just another Cadillac in the lineup, it was the model that showcased everything the brand could offer. Design, finishes, presence, everything taken one step further, and you can feel that from every angle. There are no weak parts, no elements out of place. Everything is designed to make an impact, but with control, and that's where its beauty becomes stronger, because it doesn't rely only on proportions, it relies on confidence. This car isn't searching for identity, it already found it, and that places it in a very specific position in this video. Because while other cars represent the beginning of something, This represents consolidation, the moment when American design already knew where it was going. When you look at its value today, that significance is clearly reflected. A 1954 Cadillac El Dorado can easily exceed $120,000, with exceptional examples reaching even higher. And when you look at all these cars together, you start to realize something that isn't obvious at first. Beauty didn't appear overnight. It was built, little by little, line by line, idea by idea, and you can feel that in every one of them. Now, I want to know something. Out of all the cars you've seen in this video, which one is truly the most beautiful to you? Not the most expensive, not the most famous, the one that genuinely made you think, this was already different. I'll read you in the comments, and if you like this kind of car, the ones that mark the beginning of something, you need to watch this video about the most beautiful wagons of the 1950s, because there you'll see how that same evolution also reached family cars. And when you see them, you'll understand that even the most practical ones could still be incredible. See you in the next video.